Hello and welcome to God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with the gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm writer and friendly neighbourhood podcaster Giles Goff.
And I'm librarian and everyone's favourite dungeon master, Julia Hall.
And today we'll be looking at Under the Banner of Heaven, the 2022 Disney Plus series based on the book of the same name by Jon Krakauer. We'll be looking at complementarianism, wiping the dust from your feet, safeguarding against dodgy prophecies, and how we decide who's really a Christian or not. Now, it's important to say this is the first time we've ever covered a true crime story, and some of the details in this story are really quite harrowing. So if you are listening with kids, or if you're just feeling a bit sensitive, maybe skip this one and we'll see you next week. So, Julia, I made you watch this show for the podcast. What did you think?
This, I think, is so different from a lot of true crime dramatizations. What I really appreciated about this was how much it humanized Brenda, who is unfortunately the victim of the murder in this particular series, and also just didn't dwell on her death, which I find a lot of true crime really gets obsessed with just the morbidity and the death itself. And especially in a crime really as horrific as this, I appreciated that they were sensitive enough to be like, that's not the important part. The important part is who Brenda was as a woman, as a person, who she was in life, which I really appreciated.
I found out whilst researching this, Brenda Lafferty could burp the alphabet as well. I really appreciated how they showed just how wonderful she was as a person, and that was kind of like the point, and not, oh, she died horrifically and these guys are also crazy. It was such a love letter to her. But this show I binged in like 2 days, 3 days maybe. It just completely sucked me in. Yeah, it really is something else, isn't it? Because first of all, I think as we've gotten a lot of true crime is getting better at not kind of going for the torture porn sort of the kind of exploitative kind of stuff. And what I think was fascinating about this show was just the way that it's part true crime, which we know where we are with that, and then also like a historical drama as well at the same time.
Period drama. I didn't expect to get the level of period drama. And actually, and my like other nerdy side is coming out, the costumes,
okay,
not bad.
Yeah, here we go.
Not bad. They're pretty good. I mean, they're pretty good. Because the thing is with the 1830s is that it's not always, I think, particularly chic silhouette, in my opinion. And so people tend to shy away from it, but they were like, nah, sleeves, weird hair, done.
Sleeves a go.
So, sleeves a go. So much sleeves in the 1830s, but I digress. So I had everything. Really gripping detective story and also a little bit of like period drama in there.
Yeah, something else. Now it's time for Julia's facts.
Ba-ba! I got a few. A lot of them, well, I think I'll start actually with the first one, which is my favourite one, which kind of like links the cinematic universe of God in Film, because there is a scene in the show where Jeb Pyrie, who is played by Andrew Garfield, he's interviewing Robin Lafferty, and he puts down the little tape recorder and he starts playing some music. The song that plays first is the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is the same song that Tammy Faye chose to perform at the college gig that she does at the end of The Eyes of Tammy Faye, which I immediately recognised. I'm not going to lie, I did Google to see if for some reason it came up in Hacksaw Ridge, because I know that Garfield and Sam Worthington both did Hacksaw Ridge, and I think it appears in Band of Brothers, but there's like a parody version of this song that you kind of see in a lot of World War II themed things, but unfortunately I couldn't, in my brief foray, I couldn't find if it connected the three.
Right.
But it does connect us back to The Eyes of Tammy Faye, which was a previous episode in this season.
I love the way your mind works. It's wonderful.
So that one I was quite excited about, so we'll come out of the gate with that one. My second fact is one that I picked up from IMDb, which I thought was really interesting. So obviously the characters of Jeb Pyrie and Paiute native Bill Taba are fiction. They're not real people. Taba is the Paiute word that means sun.
Right, okay.
As in the big
ball of fire rather than
the,
offspring.
Rather than offspring. And obviously Pyre is spelt very much like pyre.
Okay.
So both of these detectives have that kind of fiery connection.
I love that.
Between them, which I think is great because they, as characters, they kind of complement and mirror each other really well.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. I was quite surprised to find out, obviously, that the characters were fictional and that they were they're composite characters. So effectively, this is about the sort of murder of Brenda and Erica Lafferty, and by their uncle and brother-in-law Ron and Dan Lafferty. Obviously, that bit we know is true. The flashbacks to the early Mormon church, we believe that to be true, and the detectives is effectively an opportunity to have two people with real who were like are character foils to each other work together, and I thought that was really good, and I think I was okay with that. Do you know what I mean? So long as long as the aspects of the case are accurate or accurate enough, I was happy for them to invent that bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think they kind of give us an in as an audience because they are the ones kind of asking the questions. Obviously, Taba is not Mormon, so for those people watching who are not Mormon, he kind of provides that, asking the questions, clarifying things about what Mormons do. I mean, the scene where he's got his McDonald's and then Jeb, I think, has got something from home and he's like, oh, go on, take a fry, you know.
Eat it under the desk, doesn't he?
Yeah, just little scenes like that are just so cute. That was one of my favourite scenes.
You got to see how an unexamined prejudice works in this sort of context. The way they come up with that name for him from like a Lamanite and that sort of thing, that like giving people names that are contrary to how they would identify themselves. I've tied myself in knots on this one, trying to sort of stay away from the word Mormon when they want to be known as LDS and all the rest of it, but sometimes you just couldn't quite help it.
Yeah, I think it's so ingrained. LDS, to be fair, was a relatively
quite a new
term for me when I started watching Under the Banner of Heaven. I was kind of very used to just calling them Mormons. Unless we get some angry emails, I'll probably end up just defaulting to Mormon.
Trust me, considering the episode that we're covering and considering our theological background, I will be stunned if we have any Mormon listeners.
So my next fact, I've got two that are sort of similar, so I might kind of group them together. But Garfield did a lot of research for this role, which I think is quite usual for him, because when we covered Eyes of Tammy Faye, I mentioned how he would go to church on Sunday at the site of Heritage USA. He actually went to Brigham Young University campus and did some kind of chilling out there. To quote, although he wasn't discouraged, he said he had to, quote, bite his tongue a lot in the face of the, quote, almost frightening optimism coming off of its students. He also spent time in Salt Lake, quote, hanging out with Mormons, including bishops and even detectives. So it sounds like when he played Jeb Pyre, that's actually come from a genuine place almost, if he's been hanging out with Mormon detectives and kind of seeing how they work, which is really interesting. And obviously, as we've mentioned, a lot of the actors, I think, doing this have had to go to some pretty dark places while filming this. So they would often get together to play board games, they'd go hiking, and they'd watch movies in between takes as well to alleviate the stress. Because
it's a lot of British cast for this, isn't it? There's Daisy Edgar-Jones and Andrew Garfield. The brother who plays Alan, the guy who plays Alan, the husband, he's British as well. I think he's from Stoke, something like that. So, and of course, the lady playing Matilda, I can't remember her name. And then Denise Gough, or as I've decided now, cousin Denise, as I've decided. She's from Ireland. The Gough side of my family from Ireland, so that means we're definitely related. That's what I've decided.
Absolutely.
There were so many British or people from the British Isles on this shoot, and they were somewhere up in Canada filming this, and I think it was around the time of COVID that they were filming it, so I think they probably had to bubble together at some point just to get the thing filmed. So I think that made for quite a tightly knit group.
Yeah, absolutely. Wyatt Russell, this is my next fact now. So he plays Dan Lafferty, which is one of the two more extreme brothers of the group.
Evil Captain America.
Yes, Evil Captain America. I feel very sorry for Mr. Russell because I'm sure he's a lovely person in real life if I were to ever meet him. But he's played some pretty awful people. Yeah. He mentioned in an article that he actually attempted to contact the real Dan Lafferty, who's currently serving his prison sentence. In his words, what happened was, you have to give me your phone number, and like an idiot, I was like, yeah, sure. Then I was like, why would I do that? He murdered people. Yeah, I agree. Luckily for Wyatt, they took down his phone number incorrectly, so he didn't actually receive a phone call, kind of much to his relief. I think he sort of realised what he'd done maybe a bit too late, but luckily it worked out. But yeah, I think that's probably for the best. I'm not sure how I'd feel if a murderer was trying to call me from prison to be like, hey, what's up? I heard you playing me in a TV show.
As I understand it, so Ron Lafferty died of an old age, didn't he, in 2019?
Yeah.
And Dan Lafferty, as best I can tell, has shown no remorse whatsoever for the killings, which is a lot. That's not somebody I would want to have my phone number either.
Yeah, I wouldn't want anything to do with that. I think that's just not cool. It's just not okay in any capacity. But we'll move swiftly on to my final fact. So there were 5 full-time researchers on set for Under the Banner of Heaven, including Lindsay Park, who describes herself as an independent Mormon. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I assume I would take that to be taking parts of the Mormon faith without maybe being in the close-knit church. But you remember there's a scene in the show where Brenda and Alan are getting married in the temple in what's called a telestial room. Basically, we don't know what these look like because there aren't really any pictures of them, and the LDS members are kind of sworn to secrecy when it comes to this. But Lindsay Park was married in the temple, and so it was her input basically that was able to make this room happen. And in the words of production designer Renee Reed, Park, quote, crossed a line in the faith by explaining to all of us what exactly had gone on in that room. She had broken the covenant of secrecy to help us tell this important story. And for me, I think that's, I don't know if special is the right word to use, because I can't imagine what kind of conflicted feeling that must take and the energy that must take to essentially go back on something that used to be extremely fundamental to be able to tell this story to a wider audience. That's just, that baffles me.
Yeah, it's not something you do lightly, is it? Breaking that kind of, I don't like to say covenant because I don't like to use that word if I can help it. But I do sort of feel like, and this is something we're going to come back to again and again, is that a lot of what's been going wrong here is because it's festered in kind of secrecy.
Yeah.
And if you were able to completely open up these things, what's the phrase? Sunlight makes for the best disinfectant. You know, some of the things that have been going wrong here are pretty horrendous, and keeping an air of secrecy around it has not helped.
Yeah, and I think it's very strange because I imagine if I turn around to Daniel's uncle, who's a deacon, and I went, hey, what's the process of being a deacon? How was that for you? He'd tell me. He'd be like, right, I do X, Y, and Z, and then I do this. Not a single part of, if you want to find out how does Catholic Mass work, you can Google it, you can ask a Catholic, and they'd very likely tell you. I use Catholic as an example just because that's what I have at home. If you have a different fundamental Christian at home, then you can ask them. You know, store-bought is fine. I just happen to have Catholics near me. But I'm sure if you asked them, they would explain, how does transubstantiation work? If I wanted to get married, what would I have to do?
Yeah.
There's no, oh, well, you're not a Catholic, so we can't possibly tell you about that. It just seems a bit counterintuitive to me if you're wanting to convince people to join your club, but then also you can't tell them anything unless they join the club first. I don't know.
Let's drop the secret handshakes.
Yeah, it's not, this isn't the Masons anymore. Yeah. It's not like national treasure. But that was my last fact.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. As always, you always make me smile with this stuff. Store-bought fundamentalist.
That's fine.
Hey guys, it's Editing Giles here. Now, when I'm editing these episodes, I like to keep it as tight as possible and try and trim out as much waffle as I possibly can. But then it occurred to me, some of you guys might actually like the waffle. So if you head over to www.patreon.com/God in Film podcast and sign up to our Bishop Waller-Bridge tier, you'll find loads of bonus content such as extended interviews, uncut episodes where we let Julia talk about whatever she wants to talk about, and exclusive patrons-only episodes like our God in Gaming episode. So why not give it a try? And if that's not doable, did you know you can help out this podcast for free by writing us a review, giving us a shout out on social media, or just telling a friend about us? Podcasters are needy little... Well, we're pretty needy. We love to get some attention. And listen, I've seen the download figures. I know you're listening. Just tell us about it. Let us know what you think. I cannot tell you what it would mean to me to hear what you guys think of the podcast. And now, back to the show. Anyway, for this episode, we've got someone who is a good friend of mine that I've known for quite a few years now. She's got an insight into the Mormon church that is quite rare for us here in the UK, but I think will resonate with a lot of ex-Mormons. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Elise. I'm American, but I have been living in Manchester for almost 6 years now, and I know Giles as a friend of my husband.
Hi, Elise. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. When you say friend of your husband, would you like to tell people who your husband is?
Oh, sorry. Yes, my husband is Phil, who used to be on the podcast with Giles.
So this is one of the two God in Film podcast widows that you have, her and Claire. Let's just dive straight into it. What can you tell us about the LDS Church and how it came to be?
Sorry, would you like the version that the Mormons taught me as a child, or sort of like a more factual...
Let's start with what you learned as a child and go from there. That sound okay?
Yeah, great. So in 1820 in Palmyra, New York, a 15-year-old boy, Joseph Smith, says that he saw a vision of God the Father and his son Jesus Christ coming down to him while he was praying, to inform him that it was his responsibility to sort of start a new church because none of the churches on earth at the time were the correct, true, full truth church. So then a series of visions later, and 10 years later, he has now been visited by several angels. He has been led to discover a set of golden plates with engravings on them, which he's been given special tools. And 10 years later in Fayette, New York, he founds the Mormon Church.
So he's only 25 then when he founds the Mormon Church, and that puts us at what, 1830?
1830, yeah.
And you made a distinction between what you'd been told as a kid and what you know now?
Well, yes, obviously as a child I was taught that like these visions and things obviously happened like as clear fact. But as an adult, it's more of, I would say, he said that he saw these things rather than he did see these things.
Yeah, no other witnesses to corroborate it.
Yeah, I suppose except for other people who had something also to gain from corroboration.
Yeah, okay. So obviously that takes us up to 1830, but like, where is, just so I can check my terminology, is it politically correct to call them the Mormon Church, or do they not like that term anymore, or what's the thing?
They've sort of gone through a journey of it. There was a whole, when I was a kid, there was a whole I am a Mormon movement where people, like, they sort of embraced the term because it was commonly known. But I think that these days they prefer LDS or the latter, because the proper name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. People call them the Mormons because the book they have is the Book of Mormon. So I think that these days they prefer LDS or Latter-day Saint.
Okay, all right. And like, obviously you grew up in Utah, right?
Sort of. I grew up until I was 14. I lived in Michigan, in fact, but then we moved to Utah to be closer to my grandparents and aunts and uncles and things.
So what was it like growing up in such a strong Mormon community?
I would say for me, to be honest, it's just normal. Like, that's just like how it was. This is how childhood is. But I think when I reached adolescence, I really started to kind of take issue with the amount of control and the things that were controlled, and to feel quite restricted and skeptical, I would say.
When you say the things that were controlled, can you be a bit more, could you expand on that?
Yeah, I think that like it sort of became clear to me as a teenager that the control that the church had wasn't really for people's safety or for like their eternal salvation. It was like, we want to control women specifically and people who are different than us. And I remember being taught very specifically many times that like my duty in life was to be a wife and a mother and to raise children in the church. And sort of there wasn't anything else that I could do. There weren't any other expectations or possibilities. Like that was it. My job was to support my husband and raise children. And I just thought maybe I want that. And in fact, like now I am married, I have a child, but it's not the sole thing in my life.
It's the difference between having it imposed on you and having it on your own terms.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like from what you're telling me, that's like the mainstream Mormon LDS church. That's not the
I wasn't part of any fringe group. No.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, just for the listeners at home, could you distinguish between what the LDS is and what like any FLDS groups are?
Yeah. So it sort of goes back to after the founder of the church, Joseph Smith, passed away, there was sort of a lot of dissent, like who's going to be the leader now. And the mainstream group chose Brigham Young to be their leader. And then some offshoot groups chose several different leaders, right? And then they took the doctrine in sort of different ways. So there's now, you'll have seen in the news and in documentaries and things, the FLDS, who are the polygamists with the dresses and the hair and keep sweet, them. And there's also some offshoot groups in Idaho who maybe believe more fundamentalist things. And I realized through watching Under the Banner of Heaven that there's also some interesting groups in other places as well that I hadn't heard of before.
That phrase, keep sweet, what is that?
Oh, so Warren Jeffs of the FLDS said frequently to his female followers specifically, keep sweet, as a way of saying don't cause ripples, don't really speak your mind or have emotions, really. Your job is to behave in a sweet, gentle manner and be docile.
Right, okay, all right. So that's that phrase, keep sweet, that's specifically like an FLDS thing. That's not like a mainstream thing.
Yeah, it's not really a mainstream thing, no.
Okay, fair enough. So you'd been sort of brought up in the LDS church like all your life. And what changed for you? What made you leave?
So what made me leave really was sort of like a gradual loss of faith as a teenager. And then I moved to Idaho to go to university, BYU Idaho University, when I was 17 years old. And sort of being on my own for the first time, but still surrounded by all of this religion, I just realized that it didn't align with my beliefs and my values. And it's not something that I wanted to continue doing. And I also noticed a lot of like women who were close to me who were unmarried, rather than just being accepted as whole, complete people, they were told things like, your time will come, you'll marry in heaven, sort of as if marriage was the only thing that would like validate them as a human. And I just didn't want that for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds exhausting.
Yeah, so I went there for one semester and then I moved to Barcelona and started a new life, and here we are.
I love that you went to Brigham Young University, like the Mormoniest place you could think of.
Yeah.
And then...
Do you know why I went there, though? It's because of student loans. That sounds so stupid. But I remember looking at the student loans while I was doing all of my uni applications. Like, I was accepted to NYU, but it was just so much more expensive, and I just thought I'd never pay that off. But for Mormons, BYU is significantly subsidized if you can get a recommendation from your bishop. So... I mean, I don't have a student loan anymore from one semester, but I would have if I'd gone one semester to NYU.
Wow, yeah. So it's like you traveled almost as far as you could possibly get from that sort of...
yeah.
From that world. But you've still got family in the church, right?
I do, yeah. Quite a bit of my family is still in the church, yeah.
So does that ever come like as a source of tension, or how does that work?
I think in the beginning, sort of when I very first left, it upset my parents quite a bit. Like, I think it hurt them. I think that they had this these teachings told to them that if one of their children left the church, then we wouldn't be together in heaven. And I think that it was really quite a source of pain for them to think that because of my choice to leave the church, then if in the afterlife, we wouldn't be together. And I think they were really quite upset about that. And I also think that within the church, you get taught a lot that people outside of the church don't have happiness, which is, it sounds strange to say as a person outside of the church now, but you really are taught that like when someone leaves the church, people will say things like, oh, the light has left their countenance. So I think that you sort of internalize that and think that my loved one has left this church and now they are unhappy and I don't want them to be unhappy and in pain. So I think that when I initially left, it was really hard for my parents. But I think that a couple of years in, when they could see that I was happy and I was okay and I was living a fulfilled life and I was healthy and well, I think that they really started to think that it's okay if we believe different things. Like we can still love each other and disagree.
Yeah, definitely. So for this podcast, I got you to watch some of the Under the Banner of Heaven. And how far are you into it now?
Oh, we binged the whole thing this weekend.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Okay. So enjoy it. Maybe that's the wrong word to use, but...
I mean, it was fascinating, wasn't it?
Yeah. Was there anything that jumped out at you or anything you thought was interesting?
Yes. I read that they had an ex-Mormon consult on the film. But I don't know if it was a very good consultation. Because I would notice them say a lot of things that weren't really, like they would try to take things that other people might say and impose Mormon language on it. Like, for example, at one point somebody said, oh, well, Heavenly Father knows, as if you would have said like, God knows, but Mormons wouldn't say that. Like, even like that, they wouldn't say it because they would still feel like that's taking the Lord's name in vain.
Right. So how do you talk about God then if you can't?
No, you can talk about God, but you wouldn't say it like casually, right? So do you know how people would say like, God knows, you hear enough of that these days, or something like that?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Mormons wouldn't use a phrase like that.
Right. Okay. I'm with you. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. It's so fascinating to hear your experience. And I really appreciate you coming on to talk to us today about this, because it's so rare that we kind of get like an insider's view on this stuff.
Yeah. I'm trying to be a little bit like respectful of, like, I know that people believe in this strongly, so I don't want to sort of disparage their beliefs, but I also do want to speak my truth.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Elise, thank you so much for joining us today. I looked at the numbers. Phil has done about 41 episodes, so you've only got 40 episodes left before you can catch him up on his tally, you know?
Do you know I have a 3-year-old?
Yes, I have some experience in this area. Elise, thank you very much.
Not a problem.
So, Julia, that was Elise. What did you think?
Fantastic. So good to have Mrs. Phil on the podcast here with us. Maybe in a few years, Baby Phil and / Baby Elise could be hosting this. Who knows? It's great. It's a great little family business, and we fully appreciate that.
I love talking with Elise about this because it's not, having known her for a while, it wasn't something that she sort of comes up with naturally with people. So it really felt like I felt really quite privileged to be trusted with some of these experiences.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think stuff like that is so personal, and I think especially when there's a lot of stigma, I think around that, to come forth and have the courage to chat about that on the podcast is really appreciated.
Definitely. Now it's time for Finding the Faith in the Film. Okay, so a lot to get through here. One of the things I wanted to talk about is something called complementarianism. Have you heard what that is?
It's not ringing a bell with me. No. I don't. Do you get like a free gift when you join the church? Is that what that is?
So the reason why I wanted to talk about complementarianism, not complementarianism, is that it's an attitude and it's a view spreads out through Mormons and sort of Christian churches and denominations. And I wanted to, it's not one I agree with, and I wanted to talk about it. One thing I've been trying to do is, if you disagree with somebody, what I'm trying to do is trying to use the language that they would use and relate to when disagreeing with them. Do you know what I mean? Because otherwise it ends up turning into a bit of a shouting match and a slang match.
It's always important to, when you disagree with someone, still do that in a respectful manner, more or less.
Yeah. So what I've done is I've just straight up quoted. So I found one piece called Complementarianism for Dummies by Mary Cassian, and I'm going to read out to you what I've got for you, okay?
I am a dummy, so this should be perfect for me.
Complementarians believe that God created male and female as complementary expressions of the image of God. Male and female are counterparts in reflecting his glory. Though both sexes bear God's image fully on their own, each does so in a unique and distinct way. Male and female in relationship reflects truths about Jesus that aren't reflected by male alone or female alone. Essentially, a complementarian is a person who believes that God created male and female to reflect complementary truths about Jesus. That's the bottom line meaning of the word. Complementarians believe that males were designed to shine the spotlight on Christ's relationship to the church, brackets, and the Lord God's relationship to Christ in a way that females cannot, and that females were designed to shine the spotlight on the church's relationship to Christ and Christ's relationship to the Lord God in a way that males cannot. Okay, so far so good. And then the last thing I want to say from Mary was, complementarians stand against the oppression of women. We want to see women flourish, and we believe they do so when men and women together live according to God's word. So far, so broad. You're going to want to start shouting, and I totally respect that impulse. What I'm going to ask you to do is to just hang on a little bit longer, and let's let them get everything they want to say, and then you can go nuts.
Initially, that first part, I mean, it doesn't seem perfect to me, but it doesn't seem so bad. I just fear that it is, because it is so vague and so heavily favoured of a gender binary, I fear it could be misused. That's my worry.
Do you know what's funny? We will get back to that point presently. Okay.
It's not going to be misused, right, James?
No, everything's going to be totally fine. So I got another one from Got Questions, which is a really lovely little site that I found. And they said, an argument in favour of complementarianism can be made from 1 Timothy 2, 9-15. The verse in particular that seems to argue against the egalitarian, so that's the thing, complementarianism versus egalitarianism view, is 1 Timothy 2:12, which reads, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. So that's St. Paul talking to Timothy. Again, just hold off on the shouting just a little bit longer. Paul makes a similar argument in 1 Corinthians 14, where he writes, the women should keep silent in churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission as the law says. That's 1 Corinthians 14:34. Paul makes the argument that women are not allowed to teach and or exercise authority over men within the church setting. Passages such as 1 Timothy 3, 1-13 and Titus 1, 6-9 seem to limit church leadership offices to men as well. And then they say what is truly the crux of this argument, and what many egalitarians fail to understand, is that a difference in role does not equate to a difference in quality, importance, or value. Men and women are equally valued in God's sight and plan. Women are not inferior to men. Rather, God assigns different roles to men and women in the church and the home, because that is how he designed us to function. Now, this is me talking, not Got Questions. Firstly, I want to say that I recognise the good intentions behind this interpretation of Scripture. I think it's great that the speakers I've chosen here have both said that they're against oppression of women and that complementarianism doesn't make women inferior to men. What I do want to point out, though, is the rhetoric reality gap that inevitably picks up when a church or institution adopts this complementarian approach. Julia, do you have things that you would like to say?
I mean, I'm not going to lie, I did wonder because I think apart from Jesus flipping tables, the only other kind of specific thing I really remember from the Bible, other than the really big stuff, is, because I remember doing it in our lesson once, is Paul being like, women shouldn't teach, women should shut up. And a part of me did wonder if when it would come up for me on the podcast. I'm trying to think of how I'm sort of trying to, I mean, I obviously don't agree with that in any capacity.
It's trying to work out how to respond without swearing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's in the Bible, but I imagine that you. I mean, do you sort of, when you look at that passage as a, is that kind of the stuff that you go, yeah, maybe we should maybe not take that.
Well, if I talk you through where I came to land on it, and you can go from there, is that okay?
Yeah.
So if you say that one type of person must always be in charge and another type of person must always be in a supporting role, then you will always have oppression. If you say that man is the head of the household, then you are laying the foundations for some form of abuse or other. And obviously, this show, Under the Banner of Heaven, is an extreme example of what can go wrong when you say that disobeying a husband is also disobeying God. But there are thousands upon thousands of problems that leap up before we get to this extreme point. I don't know if you remember that they don't really show who killed Brenda straight off. They kind of lead you to it, don't they? And Ron always looks quite respectable and quite sort of mainstream compared to his brothers. But the way, that moment when you see him hit his wife in the car after going to the bank, I'm like, okay, scum. I've always been of the view that if a man hits his wife, then he's not really a man. That's the logic I've worked to. I can think of at least one example from my friends where a complementarian view of marriage has ended up with it turning into an abusive one. The husband in that case told his wife that when she wasn't at work, the rest of her time, she was working for him to make the house look nice and the rest of it. And yeah, that marriage fell apart pretty quickly. But if you teach boys and young men that their views and opinions must be honoured and obeyed simply by virtue of what they've got in their pants, then you are going to end up with some exceptionally entitled men who don't see their wives as fully realised human beings. I don't doubt that there are couples out there who take a complementarian view and have wonderful, happy relationships, but your marriage might be okay, but there's probably going to be loads of marriages out there that aren't going to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, and then there's nothing wrong with being a house spouse. Dan and I have this sort of semi-unspoken agreement that if one of us makes enough money that the other can stay at home, then, we'll do that. Because, to be fair, looking after a house is in itself a sort of semi-full-time job. And if that's what you want to do, and if that is how you want to lead your life, then that is perfectly valid and perfectly fine. It's just not something that should be imposed on you because some dude called St. Paul was like, you should shut your mouth. What? I mean, is he always this unchilled? Does he generally just not like women? Is that like his vibe?
So first of all, you have to remember, Paul starts the story as being called Saul, the Pharisee, who was mainly known for killing Christians on a massive scale. So, how can I put it? We have to acknowledge that, at least in terms of his personal journey, Paul has really come a long way. Do you know what I mean?
This is a redemption arc for him.
If we are grading on a curve, he's doing brilliant.
Wow, Paul, my guy.
You need to check out one of our earliest episodes where I compared Paul to the T-800 from the Terminator, and it still stacks up that. So
that does put things into perspective now.
Anyway,
very much so.
I'm not going to go into a long, detailed biblical rebuttal of why complementarianism is wrong, because at the time of writing this, I was holding a newborn in one hand, had a massive pile of laundry, and I was picking up the toddler in 30 minutes. So I just physically didn't have the time. There are arguments out there, and I invite you to go seek them out. I will also put the links to the places I looked for stuff on this in the description.
Yeah, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. This is not good to This is not a take.
But the way I've interpreted these passages in Timothy is that at that time, women were not allowed to be educated. So I can see the logic in not allowing someone who's not had any theological training to preach. And as for the not talking during the service, well, obviously, you wouldn't want people chattering while you're trying to give a sermon. That would be quite annoying. Speaking to somebody who has had kids talking in their lesson, it's kind of a bit of a pain. Do you know what I mean?
I feel like if you wrote a book about how you want people to conduct in your school, you'd probably be like, students shouldn't talk in my lesson, not like girls.
Yeah.
It seems somewhat unfairly.
No, yeah, you're right,
unfairly targeted.
And you're not wrong. And also, like, you got to remember, Paul was a man of his time. Do you know what I mean? He's not. There's going to be an aspect to him where it's going to be unfair to judge exactly what he says by 21st century standards. And if we think about that idea of like women talking during the sermon, then it kind of becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, because if women are not fully allowed to engage with the scriptures, it's not surprising that they would have been talking, because they weren't engaged by the sermon, you know?
Yeah, it's, to be fair, behaviour that you see in a classroom. If some students can't engage or access the work, then they'll make their own fun. They'll chat to their mates instead.
So we've talked about the challenge of trying to work out what was just for then and what is for all time, and it wouldn't surprise me to think that St. Paul would have had some unexamined anti-women opinions. But I've got to say, I can't help but think that if Paul were alive today, seeing how women can preach and lead in different contexts, I can't help but think he might have said something different.
You would hope so. I mean, if he can go from killing Christians to being like, actually, Jesus is pretty cool, you would think that there's hope for him. You'd like to think so.
Yeah.
Or at least I, on behalf of you, also would like to think so, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm not his number one fan.
Yeah, no, I get this, but also this is the guy that also wrote the love chapter. Love is patient, love is kind.
Oh really? That's that
same
guy. This guy,
same dude,
this
and not
guy,
only that, same letter, okay, to the Corinthians. This is somebody who has an evolved concept of what it is to love and how to show love to people. So he has it within his capacity. You've got to remember, he is writing a letter to a church at a specific time. There was loads of stuff going on in Corinth that was problematic as hell, and he's writing advice to them. And I remember Steve Chalk, who is, I think he's the leader of the Oasis Trust in Britain. We've tried to get him on the podcast before, not had any joy. Steve, you are welcome at any time. He said at one point he was like pastoring two different churches. He was kind of being in a support role, and he'd written letters to them back in the 80s about advice about how to deal with certain situations to one church, and then written very different kind of letters to a different church giving them advice about how to deal with their situation. And he said, if you try to extrapolate my theological position based on these two different letters, that would be insane. Do you know what I mean? It would be disingenuous. And I think there are, throughout the last 2,000 years of patriarchy, which, if you were paying attention, wasn't great, there have been people who wanted to keep women down, and they've seen these verses, and these verses have been incredibly convenient for them.
Yeah.
Now, I do think there are certain roles that some genders will fulfill better than others. For example, I think women really do have the lead with the whole having the babies thing. They've absolutely nailed that.
I think they are generally better.
Generally, it's a general rule. And also, fellas, I feel like we've cornered the market on peeing standing up. Like, well done, lads. Good job, everyone.
Yeah, we're catching up. I mean, the whole Shiwi phenomenon. We're getting there. We'll catch you up.
Yeah,
Don't get too comfy on that stance.
But obviously, there are some fairly obvious areas where there are certain genders that are going to do better in certain roles than others. If you're in a ministry that predominantly deals with women, then to me it makes sense that that role would be fulfilled by a woman, or at least have them in a client-facing position. For example, if it's anything to do with domestic violence or anything like that, you're going to want a woman to be able to deal with other women in that situation. But also, if it's you taking that particular stance, men who are victims of domestic violence need male workers as well. Yeah. So, yes, there are certain times when your gender is going to play into what role you should have. But I feel those positions are going to be flipping obvious and we don't need to discuss them almost.
Yeah, I can agree with that, I think, to an extent. Yeah, in a medical profession, you're definitely going to want somebody who has the same pieces as you, because at the very least they will understand a little bit more through their own experience how to better help you.
Definitely. Looking at the way things work in our household, that thing about the man being the sort of head of the household always kind of creeped me out a little bit. So the way we like to sort of describe it, as we stole a line from Doctor Who, where we said it's a very flat organisational structure in our household. And broadly speaking, leadership in our house is context specific. So quite simply, if you know more about a particular issue, you get to take the lead on that thing. Okay?
Yeah.
So
which should be the norm for most places.
You would think, right? So, for example, when I met Claire, she already had a flat, so she'd already been through the whole process of getting a mortgage and everything. So Claire takes the lead on mortgages, and I have had so many crappy cars over the years. I'm getting really good at spotting the things that go wrong and with them, and I'm usually good at preventing them. So I take the lead on car stuff. And that's just one example. Yeah. There's other times where... Do you remember when Theresa May got into trouble for talking about boy jobs and girl jobs?
Simpler times. Remember when that was all we had to worry about?
Simpler times. Now, I didn't at the time, but I've certainly got a soft spot for Theresa May these days, because when you see what we could compare her with, you're like, oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And, like, it's fine for you to sort of refer to them as boy jobs and girl jobs within the comfort of your house if you've all signed up to it and all agreed to it. But it's one of those things where if you try and extrapolate it out, it becomes tricky.
On a basic level, there is no such thing as a boy job or a girl job, but it's a tough one, I think, because I especially where we are now in 2024, I don't particularly like to kind of stick with the sort of rigid kind of gender binary, because there are so many people who don't always fit into that or will change how they fit into that. It's just finding where your place is, really.
One of the nice things we do, because I can't stand rotas. Oh, you're meant to be cooking this on them, and I appreciate it works for some people. For me, it feels like another thing to forget and to get yourself in trouble with. The maxim we work at this house is, if I can, I will. If I've got the capacity to make dinner, then I'll do dinner, and vice versa. And usually, again, broadly speaking, if you made dinner, then the other person clears up. But if I've got the capacity to do the dishes as well as make dinner, I will. And we try to take it as to do it like that, because sometimes it can be like the greatest expression of love that you can think to say to somebody. You go to bed, sweetheart, I'll sort this out. I've said that. I've said that to Claire plenty of times. She said it to me plenty of times.
The only rigid kind of chores that we have in the household is I always cook, but Dan always washes up. Largely because I have slight washing up PTSD, because I lived with a housemate who, whenever he would cook, he could make a fried egg and somehow use 4 bowls, half the pans in the house, so much, and would never wash up. So it would become a game of chicken, where it's like, how long can I go with not cleaning, but also still having like bowls that I can eat out of? I would always lose. When we started living together, I was like, Dan, you need to do the washing. I'm not touching anymore as long as I live.
My second and third years at uni, I lived with boys, and one fella left the pasta in a pot for so long it started to grow furry and mouldy, and I was just like, guys, you know.
That standard, if you have not had some pot of food become a violation of the Geneva Convention, were you at uni?
Yeah, absolutely. So, broadly speaking, I don't think your gender should determine what role you do, especially when the male role is always, we should be in charge and you should be making the tea. Because, come on, guys, I shouldn't have to explain to you why that's a problem. Have you ever had that thing where you saw one particular thing at one time in your life, and it might have just impacted your entire opinion on something?
Yeah, I feel like I can't pinpoint what that is, but I feel like I've consumed a lot of pop culture,
The one for me, well, there's a few for me, but the one that sticks out for me is I remember working at a camp in America, and one kid there, she had a T-shirt that said, "A man of integrity is not threatened by a woman of quality." And that's always stuck with me because I've always felt like, and how can I put this? I've always felt like if you can take orders from a woman, that somehow makes you more manly. Does that make sense?
I remember reading, I can't remember where I read it online, but it was like a screenshot of some kind of somebody posting about an article that they've read talking about Halo.
Mm-hmm.
Which, for those of you not versed, Halo is a video game. But they found that certain types, so sort of two types of men, when they were playing and another team member was a woman, the slightly less, how should I put this? The slightly lower IQ males would kind of defy that authoritative voice from a woman and not do what she'd asked and not follow orders. And the slightly higher integrity, perhaps higher IQ men would just kind of be like, yeah, okay, cool. They would just kind of go with what the woman was saying, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah. Even like the US Marines, the fact that they've started accepting female recruits into the Marines, and their whole thing is, how effective can this person complete a mission? If this person is able to do the job, then just let them do the job. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, I think we've dealt with complementarianism, and we'll move on. The next thing, do you remember one particular scene where one of the LDS bishops arrives at the police station and he wants them to kind of wrap up the investigation to make sure that it doesn't
sweep it under the rug.
Effectively. And Detective Pyrie and I think Alan at one point are both saying they can't do that. And he does this thing where he turns around and he very dramatically wipes the dust from his feet and then walks off. So we have covered this in the past, but I wanted to cover this for you. So that is a direct line from Jesus, okay? At one point, he's sending off his apostles to sort of preach and heal people in his name, okay? This is a big deal for them because up until this point, they've only been watching him do it, so they're now moving into them doing it.
Yeah.
So this is, and he says to them, "Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts, no bag for the journey or extra shirt or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. As you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet." So, literally, what Jesus is saying, he wants to show that his apostles, his disciples are fully reliant on God. And this is something which kind of shakes down to my belief and the belief of sort of a lot of my contemporaries today. There were a lot of years for me where I'm like, I don't know where the next paycheck is coming from, but I know that there's always petrol in the tank and the rent always gets paid. God's always looking out for me. And this line about, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. And it's just a way of saying, if they're not going to listen to you, just move on.
Yeah.
We talked about this in a previous episode. It's not my job to convince you that Jesus is great. I just need to tell you. And one thing I like about it is it's really pragmatic from Jesus. You don't normally expect like that sort of gritty down to earth realism from the Son of God. And it's literally just saying, if these guys won't listen to you, just move on. What it's not is the way it's used in this show as a way of disavowing people and making people feel like scum and making feel like they've been completely disowned.
That's an interesting passage to me because I think there's a lot in, maybe part of it is stereotype, but especially in the case of some more fringe groups such as Mormons or even sort of Jehovah's Witnesses, there's that idea that you kind of have to recruit people. You have to save other people, right? So even if they don't listen to you, you kind of keep going because they need to be saved. Whereas Jesus is saying, if they're not going to listen to you, dude, don't waste your energy. Let them be them and continue on your way.
We've got a guy down the street who's a bit more of a fundamentalist. He says something like, if these people died tonight, would you have sort of told them everything they need to know to sort of get to heaven? It's the kind of phrase I've heard in the past, but the other way of thinking about it is like, yeah, but what if they don't die? If they don't die, and all they associate Jesus with is some guy who screams at them in a judgmental fashion, that's going to put them off Jesus. Like, we talked about Billy Graham in our Tammy Faye episode, about that kind of people getting saved on like an industrial scale, and Andy pointed out that it doesn't really happen anymore, and that's because, how can I put it, the end figures might be high, but the percentage is really low. The highest percentage for people being converted is Christians talking to their friends. There's nothing particularly fancy about it. You've got to make sure that you are a credible source before you start making these points.
And I think it should come from a sort of no pressure background. I feel a lot, and again, I call it a vocal minority because the people I see screaming on the streets of New Street are not usual, I imagine. At least I hope not. But it seems very, you have to do this, otherwise you're not gonna be saved, and you have to do X, Y, and Z. And it seems very from a very pressured way of, if you don't do this right now immediately, then Jesus is done.
When I see
it's very weird.
So when I see street preachers, a lot of the time it's not that I disagree with the message, it's that I disagree with the medium. What generally speaking, in the past where I've seen street preachers in Manchester, I've just nipped into a shop, bought them a bottle of water because they probably need it, and they probably need, like when the sort of kids are making fun of them or whatever, they probably need just like one person to let them feel like, I'm on your side.
Yeah, like I
Do you know what I mean?
Never in a million years go up to a street preacher and harass them, or do you know what I mean? Like that. And the same way is, because I'm sure I'm not the only one, when I have been approached by a Mormon on the street or had a Mormon knock on my door, again, I don't harass them. I don't, tell them to F off. I'm as respectful as possible, because I can't imagine how many doors they must get slammed in their face on a daily basis. And even if they are Mormon, and even if I perhaps don't fully agree with their theology, they don't deserve to have a door slammed in their face. So I always to be fair, I usually just ignore them and kind of carry on with my day. But never in a million years would I feel entitled to turn around and harass a street preacher, because I don't particularly feel like converting. It's just it's counterintuitive, and I think it only kind of further serves that kind of us and them dichotomy that I think maybe a few of these street preachers might have.
It's interesting you talk about that us and them mentality, because they send missionaries out. The Mormon Church sends missionaries out to all different parts of the world, and to an extent, getting the door slammed in your face is part of the point, because it then reinforces the message that, the outside world is cruel and unusual and they don't care for you. We're the only ones who care for you. And it reinforces that sense of otherness and an us against the world kind of thing. The next thing I wanted to talk about was safeguards against dodgy prophecies, which we see a lot of in this show. We see Ron and Dan Lafferty have revelations from God that seem to be oddly self-serving. And then we see earlier in the flashbacks, we see Joseph Smith having incredibly well-timed revelations that seem to back up whatever he needs it to be in any given moment.
Yeah, it just, for me, the whole sort of founding, and again, I do try and say this with some respect, because, at the end of the day, we're having a civil conversation about this, but for me, some dude saying, yes, I found these golden tablets, which only I can read, and they tell me that I can do X, Y, and Z, also more wives, please. No, you can't read them. It seems a little counterintuitive to me, and obviously I know all religion comes from somewhere, right? If you trace everything back to its very beginnings, it starts with somebody going, hey, this is who I am, this is what I think. But I don't know what it is about Mormonism, it just, for some reason, just doesn't gel with me. I think it's the whole only I can read them.
Yeah, well, if I talk you through some of the stuff that I've got on this one, might help to sort of help you nail down what you're thinking of, okay? So obviously in the evangelical community, which as I've said I'm broadly a part of, we still believe in like personal revelations to some extent. And generally speaking, the way that'll work is you might get, sometimes call it like a prophecy or a word of knowledge, the belief that God is speaking directly to you in that moment, something like that. So if this happens in a church service, they'll go up to the church leaders, or usually the person who's running the service, and tell them about it privately. And then the church leader will make a decision about whether it's a good idea to share that word of knowledge, or whatever you want to call it, with the rest of the congregation, or whether it's something that deserves a bit more discussion. Now, how do you work out whether something is a genuine prophecy or word of knowledge or not? This is something I've struggled with a lot because it's not a particular gift that I've had, really. I normally, when I try and work out if God's talking to me directly, I try and think, is this a thought that I would have had on my own? And it's really hard to work out. Generally speaking, it's about, is it something that God would want me to do?
Yeah.
And it's really hard to work out, and you might not always know for sure. And do you know what? I actually really like that bit in Under the Banner of Heaven when they ask some LDS bishops this very question about how do you know if a prophecy is legitimate or not? And they respond by saying, well, we can usually tell if the prophecy benefits or edifies the people who hear it in some way. That's actually pretty good advice. The idea that it's something good, it's something not necessarily positive, but will have a positive outcome. And the reason that the character, I think it's Alan, responds against that is he points out that Brigham Young got a prophecy that ended up in people being killed. So you can kind of see how the problems come up in the LDS church. We have lots of good people wanting to make good choices that will benefit their community at large. But the people they are lionizing, the people they are actually looking to as an example, were just not good people. Yeah. Now, I'm acutely aware there are people throughout history who've called themselves Christians who have not acted in a way that is honouring to Jesus. And the way I try to deal with that is we try and look at them in like a balanced fashion. We don't let the bad eclipse the good or vice versa. What's that phrase? If you're studying history and you're feeling good, then you're not really studying history.
Yeah, I think it's maybe once a year where I learn something new about something which I thought I knew about, and I'd go, okay, yeah. Oh, that's sad. It's sort of the equivalent of learning that a favourite celebrity of yours has said something slightly problematic on Twitter 8 years ago, and you kind of have to mollify that. Within you. Yeah.
I think we've talked about in the past. My favourite singer growing up was Michael Jackson, and my favourite band as a young adult was Lost Prophets. So I'm used to this feeling quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a rough one.
Yeah,
that's a rough combo. My condolences.
So, whilst the modern LDS Church are trying to distance themselves from some of the more radical elements that their prophets like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young have said, they are still putting these people on a pedestal. Joseph Smith is still credited as the founder of the religion on the website, and Brigham Young literally gets a university named after him. Yes. You know?
I think when we've kind of had discussions about this before, I think you phrased it best when you said that they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. If you're going to memorialise these people, especially for Brigham Young with his university, then that, to me, that kind of means that you are therefore standing behind him. And again, from how will we learn our history from these things? You don't learn history from statues. Statues commemorate things. Statues are a way of saying, hey, we think this guy was really cool. When you commemorate something, you are saying, hey, we like this person, or hey, we think this person did something important and something great. And I suppose, in a way, yes, Brigham Young arguably was quite important to the Mormon religion. You are either commemorating him because of that, or you don't support. I don't think you can't really do both, in my opinion.
Yeah. So, with that in mind, these terrifying fundamentalists that we see in the show, in the form of Ron and Dan, are an inevitable consequence of the teaching of these Mormon leaders. Do you remember how we talked about in the June episode how Paul Atreides is like a manufactured Messiah because
Yes.
many people know about the prophecies relating to the Kwisatz Haderach, and they all try to make their kid be the Kwisatz Haderach and the rest of it?
Yeah.
Well, there's kind of a Mormon equivalent, okay? So there's this letter that Joseph Smith writes in 1832, so quite early on. He writes it to William W. Phelps, where he mentions this idea of the one mighty and strong.
Yes, that contextualizes things actually for me, because obviously this comes up in Under the Banner of Heaven, where they're sort of trying to figure out if one of the Lafferty brothers is the one mighty and strong. So that's filled in some blanks.
I'll read out what it actually says. It shall come to pass that I, the Lord God, will send one mighty and strong, holding the scepter of power in his hand, clothed with light for a covering, whose mouth shall utter words, eternal words, while his bowels shall be a fountain of truth, to set in order the house of God, and to arrange by lot the inheritance of the saints, whose names are found, and the names of the fathers, and of their children, enrolled in the book of the law of God, while that man who was called of God and appointed, that putteth forth his hand to steady the ark of God, shall fall by the vivid shaft of lightning. Joseph, flipping, use a full stop, mate. That's
a comma.
That's all I'm looking for. So anyway, this idea that there's a one mighty and strong who is going to come along and set the house of God in order. Okay, did you know that the time since the foundation of the Mormon Church, there are 20 men who have self-identified as the one mighty and strong?
Oh, see, I would have thought. I actually think that's quite a low number.
The number of people identified as it was somewhere in the 30s. This was just pure self-identified, okay? And the guys we're talking about are people like Warren Jeffs, Rulon Allred, Ervil LeBaron, all
these are some names.
Fundamentalist, polygamist cult leaders who, like, oppressing women is like the entry level stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this concept about the prophecies, it's, and the way we end up with fundamentalist people who believe in things like blood atonement, I'm almost tempted to say it's not a bug, it's a feature. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think considering everything that we've talked about, obviously with the complementarianism, is that the word? Am I saying that right? It just kind of lends itself, really, doesn't it, to being abused and being misused and having convenient pieces of scripture there that you can draw from to excuse your bad behaviour, to put it mildly.
Yeah, definitely. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is whether Mormons are Christians or not. Now, this is quite a tough subject, and it puts me in a position I'm not used to being in, or that I feel totally comfortable in, because it's something of a kind of gatekeeper stance on this issue. I'm normally not a big fan of that. So if I explain like the genesis of wanting to do an episode on Mormonism, then we can take it from there. The TLDR version is Mormons say they're Christians, but other Christians say they're not. Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense so far.
So I was having a conversation with a friend about polygamy, as you do, and she brought up the Mormon Church, and she said the Mormon Church, which I know is kind of, there's a big debate about whether or not they count as a branch of Christianity, and I kind of jumped in and like, no, there isn't. And then she says, as an outsider to Christianity, I just kind of go, well, if someone says they're a Christian, I'm not going to argue with them. And now, this was the start of one of the longest, most brutal and enduring arguments we've ever had.
Yeah.
This might seem like a very oblique topic to fall out with a friend over, but I'm hoping by the end of this section, I'll be able to make it clear why this was such an issue. And also, this is something that Elise and I have had discussions about off mic as well, and it's an area where we respectfully disagree. So what I'm going to try and do now is try and analyse the issue as dispassionately as possible and let you make your own conclusions. So at the start of it, it seems obvious that the LDS is Christian. I mean, the full name is Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, right? So let's dig into this a little bit further. As we've covered, the LDS Church was founded by Joseph Smith. He apparently had a revelation, wrote that down in several books. And in fact, Joseph Smith wrote 3 books: the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. And in the LDS Church, these 3 books stand alongside the Bible as scripture. They are given equal weight. Now, if I give you just one quote from Revelation, which is the crazy, wacky last book of the Bible, okay, where it says, "I warn everyone who hears the words of prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues described in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of this book of prophecy, God will take away his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book." So adding stuff to the Bible in Christian terms is a big no-no. There are multiple different interpretations that you can find of the Bible, going all the way from like the King James version to the NIV to the New Century Version. If you ever get a chance to hear the Message version, I highly recommend it, because it is written in 21st century vernacular and it's brilliant. People can interpret the Bible differently, and so long as it's done in good faith, I'm fine with that. You know, let's have a conversation. You think this word means this, you think it means that, that's fine. But literally adding stuff, that's not okay. You know?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess a certain level, perhaps maybe entitlement isn't quite the right word, but a certain level of, I mean, if this is the case, I could, when I get off of this recording, just go and casually write another book of the Bible, right? Who gets to add to stuff? Like, what makes Joseph Smith different enough, right? That he can just kind of go, yeah, and by the way, there's 3 more books of the Bible. Thank me later. It does seem weird.
I mean, if we think about it, even your boy Martin Luther, he wrote his, I want to say 95 Theses.
Yes.
And nailed them to the door. And he was like, the Catholic Church has got it wrong. We need to do this. And at no point is he saying, I've had a personal revelation from God, and these words are scripture. My word is gospel. If you don't agree with me, you are going against God himself.
Yeah, he literally went... He combed through the Bible, and one of the big takeaways was in the Catholic Church at that time, the idea was you could kind of buy your way into
plenary indulgence.
Maybe like a prosperity gospel kind of idea. So if you paid money to the church, that would basically get you less time in purgatory and more time chilling out in heaven. And Martin Luther went, so I reread the Bible, guys. There's nothing in the Bible.
That's not in it. I learned the Latin.
That's not in it.
I went through. I couldn't find it. That is...
This kind of seems shady to me. And he called them out.
Yeah, and that's totally valid. And that is a part of that thing. You could argue that this podcast exists within the tradition of looking at the Bible and coming up with an interpretation that works for you. I'm not saying that anything that I've said should be treated as gospel. I think if I say something that you disagree with, then I really want to hear what you have to say, and let's talk about it and let's knock it back and forth. The idea that somebody would sort of write something and say this word is literally scripture is just presumptuous and rude.
Yeah, and although it seems like I guess we're lucky almost that only one guy's done this.
Well,
I suppose Dante's Inferno is more like
Christian fanfic.
Fiction, right? A little self-insert fanfic.
I mean, I have done the self-insert biblical fanfic myself plenty of times, you know? I do poems pretty much every Christmas on this stuff. And it's just my way of saying, this is how I see this particular thing. Your mileage may vary. And when we have prophecies, nobody's saying, well, we need to accept that as a word of God. You know, we had to, or as a absolute gospel word of God. One of the church leaders has this thing where he talks about things being written in pencil, pen, and written in blood, you know, and the written in blood is the stuff that we think is, you can't change. Jesus, Son of God and man, died, rose again, all that stuff. Pencil is like your own personal view on things, Are you premillennialist or amillennialist or all that sort of stuff? Do dogs go to heaven? This kind of thing, where you're allowed to have your own personal view. And then stuff called written is in pen is like stuff we believe as a church, or as stuff we have to have an opinion on about, like should women be allowed to lead, that sort of thing. So then to go around saying every word out of my mouth is gospel, it's just rude, and it's just spiritual abuse.
I think it's easy to see why they were unpopular, because that presumptuous, I think, is a good word for it. What are you doing, Joseph? What is everything okay, babe?
And the thing I'm thinking about is, one of the arguments I've heard is, yes, they're a Christian, they believe in Jesus, and like, yes, they do, but so do Muslims. Muslims believe in Isa and Jesus being a prophet. Believing in Jesus is not enough to make you a Christian.
Yeah.
And when you've added so much to it that you've got something else to quote, let's say, just for argument's sake, you are a massive Beatles fan.
Yeah.
Absolutely huge. Flipping love the Beatles. You love their stuff. You love the Beatles as a group. You love their individual stuff. And you loved it when Paul McCartney did that duet, The Girl Is Mine, with Michael Jackson. Right? And then you go down a rabbit hole finding out Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5, and you start quoting Beat It in conversations, and you mention how much you liked Dangerous and the fact that it was produced by Teddy Riley, and how amazing Michael's dance moves were, and let's not worry about all those child abuse allegations, they were totally fine, there's not a big deal, it's for everyone's just making up. After a certain point, you've got to say about that person is a Michael Jackson fan more than they're a Beatles fan. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I did actually go back and look at what my textbooks had to say about the Mormons, because if you are unlucky enough, as I am, and as some of my students are, to still have to do the American West as your GCSE history, snooze fest. And I was really intrigued as to what the textbooks were saying. And I feel like, from what I know from Mormonism, there seems to be much more emphasis on what Joseph Young is saying, on what Brigham Young is saying, on what those prophecies are saying, and less on what Jesus thinks about certain matters. I had to write this down because it bugged me so much. One of the textbooks wrote that Brigham Young was, quote, very considerate to marry 8 of Smith's former wives after his death. So, yeah, very considerate. So I took those textbook passages with heavy fistfuls of salt. But yeah, there seems to be a lot more emphasis on what the Mormon side is doing, rather than on what Jesus is saying.
And
and on any of that kind of aspect of
Jesus loved women. Jesus thought women were great. I fully understand. Obviously, he picked 12 men to be his apostles. I tend to think that was probably to do with the culture of the time, that a woman travelling on her own preaching is going to be a lot less listened to and a lot less safe than a man would be. Yes. But when Jesus came back from the dead, he could have picked anybody to appear to first. He literally chose Mary Magdalene. She is the first person to preach the resurrection because she was the first one that saw it. So if you've got a prophet whose words are disagreeing with Jesus and you're picking what the prophet says, then you're not a Christian, mate. I'm fully willing to accept that they are an Abrahamic faith, but Mormons are Christians in the same way that I'm a Jew. It doesn't make any sense.
Overlap. The characters overlap, but it's not like Angel is not Buffy and Buffy is not Angel. The characters overlap, but they're fundamentally very different shows.
Yeah, there was discussion about the use of the word restored church rather than reformed. So Church of Latter-day Saints believe they are the restored church, not reformed, in that they've not looked at church that's come before and said, oh, how can we tweak this and make this different? They literally believe they are what the early church was like based on this revelation. The thing that swung it for me was the idea of baptism.
Oh, good. I was hoping we would get onto the subject of baptism.
So, full disclosure, I'm going to say the thing that's going to contradict what I was going to say, but broadly speaking, if you get baptized in one church and then go to a church in another denomination, they're not going to make you get baptized again. Full disclosure, I got baptized twice because I was raised Catholic. I had the infant thing, but when I decided I was going to follow Jesus, it made sense to me to have my own baptism that was on my terms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a confirmation.
Yeah. But broadly speaking, if you shift from one denomination to another, they're going to be like, yeah, well, you've been baptized once, that's fine. Mormons don't have that. Coming from their website, it says proper baptism is a prerequisite for membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So previously baptized people are baptized again if they wish to join. And another thing was like Mormons don't accept non-Mormon baptism, and most non-Mormons, Christians, don't accept Mormon baptism. So if you're saying that any baptisms you had before don't count and you have to be baptized to join our church, then what you're saying is those other churches are getting it so wrong and you're the only ones getting it right. Yeah. So when Mormons say they're Christians, what they mean is, yes, we're Christians and everyone else isn't really a Christian.
Yeah, it does seem to put a very big divide between them. This is my fun story time. I actually went to a Mormon baptism.
Yes, you were telling me about this.
Yeah. So this is the most interaction that I've ever had with Mormons. But I say a friend and somebody I knew at university decided that they were going to become a Mormon. And I think looking back on it now, I think this is also partly why I kind of get the ick from Mormonism, because this person, it's hard to see, I think, at the time. I mean, we were in second year of uni, so I'm like 20 at most. I don't know anything. I think I know things. I don't know anything. But this person, I think, they had self-esteem issues, which meant that they often kind of went out into attention-seeking behaviour, very much needing an unhealthy way of kind of coping, I think, with certain aspects of their mental health. So I think that's the person that we're looking at. And obviously I think with something like the Mormon Church, where they're kind of going, everyone else is an otherness, we are the only people that understand you, we are the only people that can save you. I think that very much leans into, I don't want to say praying, because that's not what I mean. It's a very harsh word, I think, for what I'm trying to say, but they're able to speak, I think, to a certain category of people like that. So for some background, this was kind of that person. Myself and a friend of mine, we were invited. We went to this very plain kind of like church hall type building. We had to sing hymns. I actually don't mind singing hymns because I like to play a game, which is 9 times out of 10 I will have never heard sing before ever in my life. So can I figure out the whole tune by the time that the hymn has ended? Is a game that I like to play. And then we'll call her Anna. That's not her name, but she had to wear like a white dress, basically to symbolize kind of like the purification and the newness. She got dunked. It was a full, so it's almost like half a hexagon kind of shape pool, very narrow but very deep. So this was the exciting bit, to be fair. So her pastor, bishop,
I have no idea,
priesthood holder,
frankly, I think it's a struggle to call yourself a bishop if you're not going to wear one of the funny hats. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, come on, guys.
Standards.
Funny hat and funny scarf, absolute bare minimum. But it was a full backward dunk kind of situation.
That's not different from the actual baptizee bit.
Is that usually how you baptize adults? Because I've never been baptized, so I'm.
Yeah, that's,
by some standards, I am going straight to hell.
Yeah, that's how you do it. You usually there's two guys on both sides, so that they don't drop you, depending on how big a person you're dealing with. And you go back, and then you come up really quickly because obviously you don't want to be drowned. I actually got baptized in Llanberis Lake, and I was just wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I think
that's cool. Like a full ass lake, that's very cool.
The thing I wanted to talk about is why was this argument about whether Mormons are Christians or not such a problem for me? And One of the things that I struggle with is anybody who's an ex-Mormon is going to really struggle hearing the message of Jesus when they think they've already heard it before.
Yeah.
It's... I can't think of a better way of putting it. It dirties the brand. It says that loving God is something when in fact it's not that at all. And so it makes the job of like anybody trying to sort of talk about Jesus harder, because if you associate Jesus with the people who are oppressing you, then of course you're not going to get through.
Yeah, that's going to be a source of pain and trauma.
And on a personal level, when my friends said that who are they to judge when I'm telling you then, it would be like saying, oh, well, you're an atheist. You know who else was an atheist? Stalin. Flipping out.
Yeah.
So I guess you're happy with them sending all those guys to the gulag, aren't you? It's like, that's not me. I want to be so far away from that as possible. And it's...
Yeah.
I think...
But there are bad examples in all groups. That shouldn't colour every single member of that faith. I mean, the one good thing about this baptism is that the spread. One thing I really resonated with when I watched the Under the Banner of Heaven, you know the bit where Jeb's like, oh man, I'm going to be working late and I can't get home for the daughter's birthday. And is it the Relief Fund or something that they're called? But basically, all the Mormon mums and grandmas descend with a spread. The spread at this baptism wasn't.
Yeah, with a lot of religious groups, the
good.
food is usually pretty good.
Yeah.
I think it's time for us to end it there. So,
yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you still are listening, I mean, well done. Good job.
You get a gold star.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. Please join us next week for our hopefully much more straightforward and, God willing, much shorter episode on The Chosen Season 2. Julia, have you had a good time?
I think so. I've definitely learned. I learned a lot of things. I've finally been able to tell that baptism story because I've been holding on to that for years. Literally years.
Okay, thanks very much, ladies and gents. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.
God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff.
That's me.
Mixing and editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by
Julie Walsh.
And our theme tune was composed by
Rick Lee.
Waffle editing by
Natalie Miniker.
Please rate and review.
Unless it's a 1-star, in which case, don't leave us a 1-star review. That would be so mean. You don't want people to think you're mean, do you?